Welcome to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, Ciaran O'Connor. I am joined today by Professor Loretta Ross, a longtime academic, feminist activist, and an advocate for reproductive justice, especially among women of color. Professor Ross currently teaches at Smith College in Massachusetts, where she leads courses on white supremacy, gender, and human rights. She is the author of a forthcoming book on call-out culture, and she was recently the subject of an in-depth profile in the New York Times entitled, "What if instead of calling people out, we called them in?" Loretta, welcome to the Braver Angels podcast. You are our first guest of 2021.
Well, thank you. And it's wonderful to be your first guest. And hopefully 2021 will be much better than 2020 was.
I think so. I feel a sense of hope already. Well, before we talk about your current work and some of the ways in which it overlaps with the work of Braver Angels, can you tell our listeners a little bit about your own story? How did you develop this passion and interest in reproductive justice and racial politics? And how did it lead you to where you are today and the issues you're talking about today?
I didn't actually start out to become an activist. It was because I came from very conservative parents. My father was in the military for 26 years, so I was an Army brat. He was pretty conservative, a member of the National Rifle Association. My mother was a Southern evangelical Christian woman from Texas, and that's where I was born, in Texas. And I went to college intending to major in chemistry and physics, and that's actually what I did. I would have become a nerd if my plumbing hadn't gotten in the way. At the age of 14, my mother thought that it was okay for an older cousin to babysit me, and instead he decided to have sex with me. He was 27 and married, so it was totally inappropriate for him to get me drunk and take advantage of me, which is basically what he did. And I became pregnant through that incest. And even then, I hadn't planned on becoming a teen mother, and certainly not that way. But when I had my son at this Catholic hospital, the hospital, for some reason, decided to bring my son to me after his birth when he was supposed to be just processed out for adoption, because that's what you did in the 60s. You went to this home for unwed mothers and you gave the baby up for adoption, and then you returned to your life as if you'd just been on an extended vacation somewhere. But when they bought me my son and I looked down and he had my face, I couldn't go through with the adoption. I kept saying, "He's got my face, he's got my face, he's got my face," because he really did look just like me. And so at 15, which I turned by that time, I became a teen mother. And that changed everything. I mean, my plans for college nearly got torpedoed, even though I had a scholarship to Radcliffe. Radcliffe rescinded the scholarship, but they couldn't rescind my admission. And so they admitted me, but wanted me in 1970 to pay $12,000 a year for tuition. And that wasn't within the reach of me or my parents. And so fortunately, Howard University gave me a full scholarship at the last minute, because I didn't even apply to Howard until the summer before the fall of 1970. And they gave me a full scholarship. So I ended up in Washington, D.C. D.C. was a cauldron of activism at the time. And my first time I got tear gas was in my dormitory at Howard University. We were on the roof, probably inappropriately jeering at the police 8 stories below us because there was a civil unrest taking place. I think there'd been some police brutality. And so we were on the roof of our dormitory, didn't have the nerve to go out into the street. We thought we were safe on the roof. And what they do, they shot tear gas canisters up on the roof to send us all scurrying back inside. And I was 16, and someone put the autobiography of Malcolm X and the book by Tony Cade called The Black Woman in my hand. And those books made a real impression upon me because I didn't know a lot about civil rights or human rights or women's rights or any of that stuff coming out of the conservative Southern Texas background that I had. But it set my path, my feet on the path towards consciousness. And then, how else to explain it? Because I don't want to sound like a sad story. I had sex with my boyfriend in college, my first boyfriend in college. He was headed to law school when I was a first year. He was in law school, first year law school student, while I was a first year freshman. And I became pregnant again. And my mother just would not sign the parental consent form for me to obtain birth control even before I came to college. And certainly after I told her I was pregnant again, she said, well, you need to drop out and come on home and have that baby and take care of the baby mom already taken care of. And I just couldn't see myself becoming a parent of two children at 16 and giving up my dreams for myself. So my big sister, Carol, forged my mother's signature on the consent form. And so that's how I was able to have a perfectly legal abortion at 16 in Washington, D.C. I was really fortunate because D.C. legalized abortion 3 years before Roe v. Wade in the summer of 1970, before I got to Washington, D.C. But that's when my consciousness around not being able to control if and when I had sex, what would happen with the outcome of that sex. You know, I had one baby, had an abortion. Really wanted to make sure that I had control over not only my sex but my reproduction. And so I accepted implantation of what's called the Dalcon Shield, which is a defective birth control device that was offered freely by A.H. Robbins at the Howard University healthcare system. And 3 years later, sterilized me. And so that finally got my attention. I was like, okay, to be told in your early 20s that you can't have any more children, that ironically, this one child that you had out of incest would be your only chance to become a mother, it got my attention. And I ended up suing A.H. Robbins for that defective Dalcon Shield, which opened the way for a big class action suit against them, which, you know, over 700,000 women around the world were damaged by this defective IUD. And that's when I became a feminist. That's when I said no to the sexual abuse, to the lack of reproductive options, and all of that. And maybe I'm hard-headed because it took a lot of things to get my attention. But also, it's kind of hard to divert from chemistry and physics and then lose all these science credits when you're going to do something else with your life. And so that's how I became an activist. And I stayed an activist for close to 50 years. And then 5 years ago, I became a teacher. I was offered a job at Hampshire College up in Amherst, Massachusetts, after I'd retired from running a lot of social justice organizations. And so I kind of consider myself a fake academic because I only have a bachelor's degree, which I only finished my bachelor's degree because I dropped out of Howard. And I only finished my bachelor's degree at the age of 55. And so within a few short years to be offered a teaching job where they call me a clinical professor because I teach in the academy the things that I learned in the community. And so when they asked me to teach, they asked me if I wanted to teach on reproductive justice. And I said no, because I could see the storm clouds of President Trump. This was in 2015. And because in the 1990s, I had done work against hate groups and was part of the anti-fascist movement, I decided that I wanted to teach a course called White Supremacy in the Age of Trump to help people better understand what an American form of fascism would look like. And Trump has lived down to all of our worst expectations, obviously. But it's a very eagerly accepted course at Hampshire College. And then I went to Arizona State. Now I'm at Smith College, because a lot of students are angry that this type of knowledge was kept from them all their lives. And it doesn't seem to matter whether they went to public school or were homeschooled or private schools. They all suffer from not being taught the history of our country. And they often kind of feel hurt because they think all the people they previously trusted have been lying to them all along when they tell these stories about how great America is and that the civil rights movement ended white supremacy and racism, and we're the greatest country in the world, and then we elect someone like Donald Trump. They're befuddled. They're like, what's going on here? And so I love teaching about fascism, and so I chose to teach that instead of reproductive justice, which I certainly could have taught that course because I've co-written 3 books on it. But I was more intrigued by the challenge of figuring out how to transmit to younger generations things that mentors like Reverend C.T. Vivian had taught me. Reverend Vivian had a famous saying. He used to say that when you ask people to give up hate, then you need to be there for them when they do. And I didn't like that message the first time I heard it, but he was right. And so I think that's what brings me into conversation with Braver Angels, because y'all are asking people to give up hate, and you're being there for them when they do.
Yes, that's a very good way to put it. I'm getting some background when I talk. Okay, it just ended, so we can cut that out. Well, that's an incredible story, and thank you for sharing those personal experiences that have led you to where you are. That's one thing we always encourage at Braver Angels when we're asking people to talk about their values and their worldviews, is to talk about the lived experiences that have informed those beliefs rather than people resorting to the talking points they hear on Fox News or MSNBC, because that's oftentimes a more powerful way to present their feelings to another person, even if, and perhaps especially when the other person really disagrees with them. So I want to get to the Times profile, which is talking about some of your current work. I read the Times profile sort of presenting you as something of a paradox. Here's this radical Black feminist who is challenging call-out culture and voicing some skepticism of trends like trigger warnings. At the same time, though, it shows that your approach is fundamentally rooted in a sense of love. What you just said, being there for people, even when they might come from a place that is not love. So some people might find those dynamics contradictory, but we at Braver Angels believe they actually make perfect sense, and that empathy is a powerful tool in the activist toolbox, regardless of whether that's someone on the left or the right. So how do you think about those dynamics? How did you feel about that profile? Do you think it was a faithful portrayal of your approach to politics and communication in the age of call-out culture?
Well, long even before call-out culture happened, or at least I noticed it because I'm kind of a late adopter of social media. So it probably had gone on for years before I noticed it. It was my grandson who said that Facebook was the only way to communicate with him that got me into social media. But even before then, I enjoyed going on right-wing talk shows and going into pro-life conversations because I was a feminist who supported, of course, abortion rights and reproductive justice. But I was also an exemplar of what they say about, a baby being born of incest and whether or not you should love the baby and hate the circumstances, and whether or not it's easy to give a child up for adoption. I found it was impossible to give up a child for adoption for me. And so I go on those shows to prove to them that they're nice little pictures of how it is when you're raped and you have a baby out of that rape, how complicated it is to become a parent and parent that child. While you're trying to give your child unconditional love, you can't help but be reminded of the circumstances by which that child came to be. And so I felt strongly for my son, who never got unconditional love from his mother because as he grew older, he started looking exactly like his father, which was not a good reminder for me. And so I spent a lot of time going into the midst of these pro-life conversations and saying, y'all have great theory. This is what the reality looks like, because I had lived it. And they couldn't understand quite often, well, we would have expected you to give the baby that came from incest up for adoption, and we would have expected you to give the baby, to keep the baby that you had because of your love relationship with your boyfriend. And I said, that's because your theories don't work in real life. That different people will make different decisions based on what's going on in their life at that moment.
So when you went to these far-right talk shows and these pro-life groups, how did they receive your presentation, your message, your communication, even the fact that you were there talking to them?
Well, generally, they always wanted to get into a debate and challenge my lived experiences. Well, it couldn't have been as bad as you said because you wouldn't have kept the child, or it couldn't have been this. But I rarely got invited back because I end up telling the truth, and I'd end up stealing their audiences from them. I remember going on Armstrong Williams' show one time. He was a Black pro-life guy that's, in politics. And I just told my truth and defended myself against his assumptions, being male, never having been pregnant, never having had my situation. So he was offering me theory, and I kept countering it with facts. And so at the end of the show, his producer got on and said, I've never seen him stumped like that before. And you have to treat him with respect. I wasn't trying to belittle their perspectives, just offer my own. And so that's how you do it. I don't go on a lot of right-wing talk shows anymore, though, because a lot of them are not operating in good faith. They will take an excerpt of what you say and extract it and distort it and things like that. I got kicked off a Laura Ingraham show one time, which was my claim to fame. Got on her show, and there were these billboards that had been put up in Atlanta claiming that the most dangerous place for a Black child is in the womb. And of course, I challenge that perception that Black women are somehow committing self-genocide when we choose to have abortions. I mean, first of all, that's a silly thing for a white person to say. And it's racist for a white person to say that, and sexist. And so she said, are you calling me a racist? And I literally counted to 5 before I said, well, I guess I am. Because if you believe those billboards, then you are racist. And so she clicked and kicked this woman off my show. I don't have to be talked to like that on my own show. I mean, the truth hurt.
Well, I wonder then, how does that relate to the distinction between calling someone in versus calling someone out? Because I could see how somebody would get defensive if they thought that you were calling them a racist and might feel like they were being called out.
Well, see, I didn't know about the call-in culture then, because I probably would have said it a different way. I probably would have said something sweet like, Laura, no, you're not a racist. You're just racially challenged, or something like that, so that I didn't give her the opportunity to become defensive. Because what she started saying was, I have children of color. I've adopted a child of color. How can you call me a racist? So she just went into a big tirade. So it was kind of like a setup question, because she disagreed with my analysis. So then she started attacking me. And that was kind of how the right wing operates. When they can't get you on the substance of what you say, then they start attacking your character, or then playing the victim card so that they can say, well, you attacked me, kind of thing. Now that I know the formula, I don't do it anymore. I don't go on those shows anymore because, as I said, they don't operate in good faith. I'm willing to call in people who operate in good faith. I'm not willing to call in people who are going to lie, who are going to distort, who are going to manipulate, because that shows that they don't want to be accountable for the harm that they're doing. They want to double down and continue it. And so I have a totally different strategy for them.
Yeah, I think that's a crucial distinction that we also make at Braver Angels between people who are coming in good faith, coming with an honest representation of their own worldviews, and then people who are doing something more cynical. And I think there's often a division there between people who work in politics, politicians, people who work in media, commentators, and then just everyday folks in their community. And I think that people these days spend so much time following politics, particularly national politics, which have this element of a binary and spectacle. And people spend so much time on the internet absorbing the orthodoxy of the tribe to which they belong, whose views are often shaped by elites who have incentives to lie and distort. And so people come to see the quote unquote other side as represented by these people who actually represent a very small minority of Americans, at least in terms of how they operate when it comes to faith. So, how do you see that distinction between people who do this for a living and have a vested personal and financial incentive in twisting people's words versus people who have strong beliefs, but whose fear and whose insecurity is being driven by that dynamic rather than sort of actively pushed? How do you see that distinction? And then how do you see the distinction between calling in and calling out?
Well, since I did this anti-fascist work from 1990 to 1995, I got a chance to really examine the white supremacist movement in detail. And I quickly realized that there was a distinction between the leaders who were quite cynical and often didn't even believe their own stuff, and the people who were manipulated by them. And so I tend to offer the benefit of the doubt to the people who are being manipulated, but never to the leaders, to the David Dukes of the world or the Pat Buchanans, because they know better. I mean, just like we know that the people in Congress right now trying to challenge Biden's election, they know better. These are people with Yale law degrees, and they're, trying to subvert the Constitution. So I would have a totally different strategy other than calling them in. But when it comes to the followers, I find that generally I can establish common ground with anybody who's simply trying to be a good person. And their definition of a good person may be different from mine. And so instead of paying attention to their words or to their behaviors, I try to go underneath and look at their values. And so I'll start a conversation around, how do you define safety? How do you define taking care of your family? How do you define taking care of your integrity, your values, those kinds of things? And I find that a lot of common ground can be created when we get to a value to value conversation, because we have many shared values. We just have different strategies to act on those values. It's the same way that I would talk to my mom, because my mom was very conservative. And she actually believed birth control was like a Bible between your knees. That was how far apart me and my mother was, because she was raised by her grandmother, who was born in 1893. So my mother had strictly Victorian values when it came to gender, sex, and sexuality. But she had started a Girl Scout troop in the 1950s because Black girls were not allowed to go to the white Girl Scout troop. So she started one for us. And one of the things she made us do almost every weekend was cook food and feed it to the homeless people. And so the way I built a bridge to my mom, I reminded her, I said, Mom, do you remember when we had to feed those homeless people when I was a Girl Scout? And she said, yeah. I said, well, can you understand that you feed the hungry? And as a human rights activist, I ask why they're hungry. So it's the same set of values expressed in a different way. And my mother got it. She finally had something she could land on and say, that's what my daughter does besides risk going to jail. She is really about asking why people are hurt and hungry and homeless. And she was all right with my work after that. But before then, she just didn't get it. So I'm saying, and the same thing, my father took me to his local American Legion because he was president of his American Legion. This is where all the old GIs go hang out and stuff. So as I said, I was raised in that military culture. And he asked me to talk to them about health care. And this was right after the government had privatized health care for the VA, for the veterans, particularly if they needed to be in hospice care or nursing homes. And the deal was that my mother would have had to sell the only house she and my father had ever been able to buy once he retired, because we moved so much, he never was able to buy a house till he retired. And she would have had to pauperize herself when my dad needed to go into a nursing home. So dad took me to his local American Legion to talk about this situation. I didn't use any of my highfalutin language about neoliberal capitalism and privatization and all this stuff. I just said, Uncle Sam reneged on the deal he promised his lifers. And this is what that reneging looks like.
Mm.
And if you make a deal with your government, the government should live up to that promise. Don't you think so? And we had a
Yeah.
wonderful conversation about values, not using my leftist language.
Yeah, I think it's a key point. So much of it comes down to language. And I think a lot of people get caught up in the orthodoxy of language within their own tribe. And there's this sense that even if they deviate from that orthodoxical language, they're somehow a traitor to the cause. And so I wonder, when you introduce these concepts and the language of call-in culture to an audience of young, predominantly left-leaning students and people on Twitter, the quote unquote woke mob that conservatives love to criticize. How do you see that message being received? Do you get a lot of pushback of people saying you're a sellout or you're a token, or are people really, when they engage with the substance of what you're saying, yeah, actually, I think that is right?
Well, first of all, it depends on how you teach it. And so if you don't mind, I'll tell you how I teach it.
Please.
The people who criticize my approach are the ones who are much more attached to being right than being effective. And so I don't have a whole lot to offer them because they will be right in a coalition of one. And I'm actually about getting the power to end human rights violations. And so the way I teach it is that I talk about your circles of influence. And we all who use that leftist language are in the 90% bubble. And we spend a lot of time talking about all the isms, sexism, racism, transphobia, capitalism, blah, 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 blah. And we spend too much time, in my opinion, trying to convince that 90% unity bubble to become 100%ers. And that's where the call outs happen. Well, if I work on women's rights and you work on environmental justice, you're doing it wrong because you should be over in environmental justice just like me, and you should use these words just like I did, kind of stuff. And that's one of the reasons that we're called the circular firing squad, because we spend our best bullets on each other sometimes. But outside of the 90%ers, there's the 75%ers. Now, me as a reproductive justice activist, I would consider a 75%er like the Girl Scouts. They may not be organizing their troops to come do clinic defense in an abortion clinic, but at the same time, they aren't going to be talking about women and girls empowerment. So I'm definitely going to see that we have common ground because I'm also into women's empowerment and they're doing it their way and I'm doing it my way. Outside of the 75%ers are what I call the 50%ers, and that's rarely where my parents land because of their militaristic background and their Christian background. They could go either to the left or the right, depending on who's listening who they're listening to. And so I want to make sure that I always use language that pulls my parents towards my end of the spectrum instead of letting them be pulled by the militarism or the faith healers that my mother loved and give money to and stuff. And so I always wanted to make sure that I was able to talk to my family. I never wanted to build a movement that my family would be outside of. outside of the 50 percenters are the 25 percenters. I would call these your average Trump voter. People who don't share a large worldview with me, but we may share some values. But at the same time, I think freedom is freedom from stupidity, and they think freedom is meaning you can not wear a mask in COVID. So we have different definitions of freedom, definitely. I'm probably not going to be very persuasive with this group of people if we don't at least have some base common definitions working. And that's why I say you have to speak to the values. And then outside of those 25 percenters, or what I call the 0 percenters, these are the people with whom I have nothing in common because I'm a human rights activist and they're opposed to human rights fundamentally. They don't believe that I have humanity that should be respected, human rights that should be respected. They're busily trying to deconstruct our democracy while I'm trying to save it. I mean, we're just on different paths. And so when it comes to calling out culture, I'm going to use my call outs for those 0 percenters because I think that they just need to be contained. I don't think I have a hope of persuading them. But anybody from the 25% onward, I'm going to figure out why me as a 90 percenter can affect the 75 percenters and then work with the 75 percenters to affect the 50s and then have the 50s affect the 25. That's how you build consensus and that's how you build power, by not seeing people who don't perfectly align with you as an enemy. They're just allies that have different points of view. And that's kind of how I approach it.
Well, I think that's one of the most clear and persuasive communications of a paradigm that I've heard. And so I think I'm going to be thinking about that for a while, because I think there is that for me as well. And I'm also now speaking as a progressive, but also somebody who's a leader at Braver Angels, that distinction between the 0 percenters, as you say, and the 25 percenters, I think also often gets lost. A lot of my friends on the left will basically say anyone who supports Trump is a 0 percenter. And even having a conversation with them is akin to legitimizing bigotry and hatred. And I think that sort of difference there is where a lot of the progress gets stopped, because if you are a progressive saying that anyone who supports Trump is a 0 percenter, or if you're a conservative saying anyone who votes for a Democrat is a 0 percenter, you are essentially writing off 60 million people. And as you said, in terms of building coalitions in such a narrowly divided country, particularly when the systems of government in the Senate and the Electoral College give such disproportionate power to rural, currently conservative states, although that could change if, say, Texas went blue. All of a sudden you might hear
Georgia did last night. I'm sorry to date the show.
No, I mean, or like
I'm in
Georgia.
I'm in
Right,
Georgia.
exactly.
And we pulled it off with organizing and talking to people in rural America. That's how we did it.
There you go. And by also turning out people in Atlanta and turning out the black vote too. So I think
But see, I don't want the narrative just to be said it's a big city and it win, because we spent a lot of time turning out and having conversations in what was written off as red Georgia. We went to those rural communities and spent a lot of time talking to people about their values. And we turned people into first-time voters talking about their values.
Yes, well, it's a very germane time to be having this discussion. And so I guess now I'd love to turn a little bit to the future. Obviously, the work that we have done has been incredibly challenging, but also incredibly needed over the past 4 years. Now President Trump is on his way out. We have an incoming president who does seem to seek to unite rather than divide, at least in his public comments. What do you think? And I'll also add, we are against the backdrop of these incredibly pressing challenges on public health, on the economy, on the social fabric, on mental health. What do you see as sort of the top line challenges and opportunities for both bridge builders and activists like yourself who understand the importance of bridge building in 2021 and beyond?
Well, I think the challenge for President Biden is going to be that he has that bridge building instinct. But again, he has to recognize that when he doesn't have partners who are working in good faith. And I'm hoping that his 8 years as vice president under Obama and watching the Republican Congress kill every Democratic impulse and ability to work across the aisle that was presented to them has wisened him up that you can only bargain with people who agree to the same ground rules you agree to, that respect the Constitution, respect the rule of law, respect procedure, respect tradition. But if people are willing to be so radical that they're going to throw that out the window, like Mitch McConnell did in blocking the Supreme Court nomination of Merrick Garland and stuff, then you don't actually have good faith partners to negotiate with. And so some people you can work with, some people you can work around. And he might have to do a lot more working around than working with, unless the Republicans recapture the soul of their party, because right now it's the party of Trump. And they need to really do a self-examination about whether they even believe in democracy anymore. Because everything they're doing since he's got elected shows me that they don't believe in democracy anymore.
Right. Well, it's interesting now that it looks like the Democrats will have a tie-breaking majority in the Senate. It's actually going to make people like, Joe Manchin, the most conservative Democrat, very powerful. And so
which is always a problem.
Well, but
he's always Republican light.
He is. Well, also, he does have to get reelected in West Virginia. So it's understandable why he, strikes those positions, but it'll be interesting to see.
Well, I'm not willing to give him that pass because I just watched 2 senators get elected in Georgia with the progressive platform. And I don't think West Virginia is any more red than Georgia was. It's a question of what do you stand for besides cynicism?
Mm-hmm. I get that argument. I think that Joe Manchin might say that he truly does believe in the moderate positions for which he stands. It's hard to know. He is trying to represent a state that supports Trump much more significantly than does Georgia, at least currently. If you look at what West Virginia went for in 2020 for Trump, I imagine it was something like 70-30.
Yeah, but the truth is, Georgia, of course, has been more of a battleground, but it became more so because of voter suppression. The worst thing that Georgia could have done was allow Brian Kemp to serve as Secretary of State refereeing his own election, because that motivated people, and particularly it motivated Stacey Abrams to get out here and change all the rules, meaning that she just built a ground game that needs to be replicated across America. And I also want to pay attention to the 2020 vote totals. And I really do believe that if you look at who was a Democrat and lost their races, it was because they were trying to out-Republican the Republicans. Why would somebody vote for a fake Republican when they can get a real one? There's no reason for that. It was the progressives who won. It was the moderates who lost. And so we really need to question that as a strategy going forward. I'm not sure in this context where somebody wants a fake Democrat or a fake Republican. We actually need to be clear what we stand for and create a difference between the parties. Now, fortunately, Republicans are self-destructing all of their own. They don't even need our help right now. But I think Joe Manchin is not going to be as comfortable as he's enjoyed before, because he could get wooed by the Republicans and the Democrats. Right now, there is no Republican to woo him with. They have to solve the problems within their own party. So he may have an imagined idea that he's going to be the deciding vote, but I'm more likely to see some Republicans who are trying to hold on to their shreds of integrity come over. Besides him playing the spoiler as he's historically played with under Obama, I think
Right. And
to calculate his standing and his reelection chances.
And it's funny for me to say this as somebody who worked on the 2012 Obama campaign when our opponent was Mitt Romney, but I think someone like Mitt Romney, who was the sole Republican to vote to impeach Trump, and maybe, someone like Susan Collins, who was reelected in Maine, you could see this little mini caucus of Manchin and Romney and Murkowski. At the same time, there's still the filibuster in the Senate.
Well, they can also take care of that because we've got the votes now to really take a good challenge to the filibuster if Biden makes that a priority. I think that there's a lot of people who are frustrated with the logjam of politics, particularly in the middle of a COVID crisis, a tanking economy, and the only people enjoying this moment are the rich 1% of Wall Street. I mean, there are more people who want this thing fixed than who are satisfied with the status quo.
Mm-hmm. Well, the last thing I'll ask you is to talk a little bit about the racial divide in the context of the political divide, because we at Braver Angels started with the Red Blue Workshop. So it was small groups of reds, folks who lean conservative tend to vote for Republican, and blues, folks who lean liberal and tend to vote for Democrats. This summer, however, in the wake of the protests around George Floyd, we started increasingly hosting discussions specifically on the issue of race, reparations, police brutality. What does racial justice look like in 2020? How do you sort of see the juxtaposition of those two divides in American life? And do you, as a bridge builder who's worked both in politics, gender, and race, do you sort of take an overall approach, or do you see kind of certain techniques and tactics that you would apply to different arenas depending on the participants and the subject matter?
Well, first of all, Black folks turned out in Georgia, as well as Asian Americans and Latinas, but we wouldn't have won without 40% of white people rejecting fascism too. And so I'm always going to start with the white people around race who are already rejecting it and maybe a little bit awkward in how they talk about it. They're the ones that may be doing the microaggressions or, staying silent because they don't want to embarrass themselves. There is a lot of racial illiteracy among white people, like Robin DiAngelo talks about. But I actually love white people who display racial courage, white courage. And so I'm going to cultivate and build upon that and not lump them together simply because of their identity with people who are proud to be racist. There's a totally different set of white people. And so I don't start with the oversimplified formula of saying that your racial identity is a predictor of your politics. I don't assume that. I don't assume that everybody who's Black is going to be a Democrat, because certainly that's not true in my community. So why would I think that everybody's white is going to be a Republican? That's just not true. And so I'm going to make assumptions that, first of all, I have to get to know you, to know where your politics are. I can't just make those assumptions based on your social location or your racial identity. I find that the best way to have white people talk to other white people is to give them that racial courage to do so. Give them the words to do so. I find that they have much more impact on their Thanksgiving dinner conversations with Uncle Frank than I'd ever have. Just like I find that conscious men make better advocates against sexism than all the feminists in the world. And so choosing the right messenger matters. And so I'm going to focus on developing the messengers that can make a big difference. And in Georgia, for example, I start with the 40% of white people who rejected Trumpism and use that as the organizing base and give them the tools and the courage to go have those conversations in those communities that I don't have access to. And even if I had access to, I wouldn't be as credible in.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I think that might be a good note to end things on, this notion of courage. We changed our name from Better Angels to Braver Angels right before the pandemic, with the idea that doing this work in 2020 requires more than empathy, respect, compassion, civility, but really does require courage. And that's something that Abraham Lincoln talked a lot about in 1861 and 1865, and is where the initial phrase of the better angels of our nature came from. And so,
can I just say one other thing?
Please.
Not only was the history of race relations hidden from most of us who went through the American school system, but the white people who stood up against segregation, that whole history has been lost to us. And so white people as a whole don't have role models beyond going all the way back to Abe Lincoln to even talk about, to say, okay, this happened in the 70s and this person did this. This happened in the 60s. What happened in the South in the 50s when they started interracial projects? We need to excavate and lift up those sheroes and heroes from the white community in our past as well, and not assume that we have to go back 150 years to find somebody.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think finding role models and heroes, both in the past and the present, gives other people courage to take that risk and take that leap, and maybe get off social media for a few minutes and have some real conversations, even if they're on Zoom like we're doing right now.
Well, you can even have real conversations on social media.
True.
As I said, I'm talking to my grandson and anybody his age. That's the only way you're going to talk to them, because they don't respond to the telephone.
Loretta, I think you should get on TikTok.
Yeah, but I can't dance.
That's where it's at now.
I know. If I could dance, I'd probably do it.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I think this was a great conversation to kick off the new year. And I'm looking forward to getting feedback from our audience on both the left and the right. So send us an email, media@braveangels.org. What did you think about this conversation? We take compliments, criticism, questions. We take it all. We want to keep the conversation going. And anyone who is interested in learning more about Professor Ross and her work, what is the best way for them to do that? When is your book coming out?
Well, the book will be out in the spring, I hope, or early summer. There's a film coming out about the call-out culture in the spring. And there'll be a lot of talk about it next year. But the best way to reach me is through my website, lorettaross.com or lorettajross.com. Either one, I own both domains. So you can reach me with or without the initial.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you again. And until next time.
Thanks for having me on your show.